Oh, I wanted to show you a little bit of where I work. I think I may be done working in Utah, at least in the long term. I really am disappointed about that. I really like this area. I think the culture is interesting of the people, but I mostly am enthralled by the topography and the geography. I worked here in 2 stints almost a year, and I was planning on working here long term, but our operations in West Virginia took a hit, and I had to go and take care of that. And I think I'm getting to the point where I'm too valuable to do other things to do this. But the guy who works out here, I needed to go to a wedding for a couple days, and the company we work for out here is fairly particular about who they have working out here, so it's either him or me. And so I'm out here for just a couple days, and I hope it's not the last time. But in case it is, I did want to record a little bit and also talk briefly. On my peak oil video, I totally forgot to put some personal anecdotal evidence regarding how much oil there is. But first, let me just show this area. In the distance, when I turn the camera around, you'll see both a homestead, and then farther off you'll see an oil rig, which is actually the oil rig I traditionally worked on. This company had 2 oil rigs, and they were essentially doing what I would consider mopping up operations. This area has been drilled extensively since the 30s. When you drive around, there's evidence of even recent drilling everywhere. It's essentially a quilt work or a patchwork of former oil pads coating this entire region. And I just approached it. I flew into Salt Lake City yesterday, and I flew in, and I'd say about 20 miles before you get here, you start to see heavy evidence of that. And if you go the other direction, there's a major city an hour to the east of here called Vernal. Vernal's actually an even bigger oil producing area than this place. There's 3 counties in eastern Utah: Duchesne, Uinta, and Carbon, I think, that account for a huge amount of oil production. Anyway, there's a valley to the south of here where the confluence of the Strawberry and the Duchesne rivers happens. These are later tributaries of the Green River and then eventually the Colorado. That gives you some idea what side of the Continental Divide I'm on. Along that valley, it's fairly temperate, but the valley is fairly narrow. There's a town in there called Duchesne, about 1,000 people. If you go the other direction, you have to go all the way to Heber City, pronounced Eber City, I guess the H is silent. That's about 80 miles to the west. And then if you go to the east, Vernal's an hour, and there's a small town between here and Vernal too. You rise out of that valley, and there's a very large, gradually sloping plain. It's flat, but it has a slope to the north. And this area is called the Blue Bench, and this culminates in a ridge. And on the other side of that ridge, the terrain changes quite a bit. The foliage changes quite a bit. If you look, I'll show you in a minute. It's scrub brush here, but you cross that ridge, it becomes juniper and salt cedar. And then not long after that, you start to get into coniferous, aspen, poplar, and then you get into the Uinta Mountains, which are they're the highest mountains in Utah. They're the most western mountain range that is considered part of the Rockies. They're also the largest east-west oriented mountain range in the United States, or at least in the Rockies. They basically run east to west, maybe 150, 200 miles, depending how you ask. Basically just past the Wasatch in, just to the east of Salt Lake City, all the way just into the Colorado border, just east of Vernal. But their highest point is in Duchesne County here, and you can actually see the highest point, which is Kings Peak. Every day when I get up, you can see it. It's brilliant. It's covered in snow. This is late spring, which is basically the pinnacle of snowfall, snow accumulation. They got about a foot here last week. It dried up just in time for me to come. But let me show you. So right adjacent, we've got So Duchesne is off in that direction in that valley. There's the road. Those mountains in the distance, there's a pass that goes over 9,000 feet, and there's a highway that goes to Price, Utah, which is one of the major cities in eastern Utah. And as I pan, I'm panning to the west. Basically, there's a valley that continues all the way up to Heber City, then Park City, and all the way through the Wasatch to Salt Lake City, about 2 hours. As you can see, there is a settlement right there. Little house. And then there, that is the oil rig. I won't say its name. There's basically a pair out here, and they're not always this close together. Sometimes, well, this is about as close as they ever get. Often they're outside of each other. The expanses out here, if you're from out east, is quite remarkable. Just standing here, you can see peaks that are 40 miles away, and even just not peaks, just flat valleys you can see dozens, 20, 30 miles away. And it's fairly flat, but there are ravines. Oh, look, I gotta zoom out. There are ravines, and some of them are big enough to actually hide an entire derrick like that. But so that's one of them, and then they switch us to work on this rig, which is, as far as I can tell, nearly an identical copy. But if I pan slightly farther, you'll see in the background behind that rig, snow-capped peaks. Those are the Uintas, but they're farther to the west. And then in the foreground, you will see the prominent ridge line that I was talking about. So that is the ridge line. There is a highway that crosses it at a low point, which I will pan over to. Actually, that low area there, that is actually a landfill called the Blue Bench Landfill. That's right at the base of that escarpment. So now I'm looking more to the north, more to the north, more to the north. And there we have, those are pretty much the highest peaks of the Uintas right there. I believe one of those is Kings Peak, the highest point in Utah. I am not 100% positive about that, but that seems very likely. You can see that there's tree cover, and then above the tree line, snow. That snow should last all summer. I've been here through the late summer into the fall. It almost disappeared in October, and then it started to snow again. And as I pan farther east, they disappear behind the ridge. And then just to give you some idea, here's the rig. So the land to the south and to the east is not as mountainous as you can see. Sorry for manipulating the camera in this way. I'm not accustomed to it. So you can see I pan there in a second. That is, I believe, I'm not an expert on the post-drilling operations. Like I said, this is an industry that very much utilizes the division of labor. I'm not sure exactly what happens to these wells afterwards, but I believe that's a condensate tank. It's a collection area. The oil and gas comes out of these wells. It collects in those, and then is piped north. There's a very small town called Altamont, population about 150, 200, and there's a huge facility there that's been basically sucking up all the oil and gas that's been squeezed out of this plateau, for decades, basically. But the landscape is dotted with collection tanks like that. If you were to look out here at night, it would actually give you the impression that it's a town, because there are lights on those. And if you look across the valley right now, it just looks like, you look across here. It doesn't look like anything, but at night it's peppered with lights. Same thing on this side, although you can't see it when you're on this side. Those aren't actually towns or houses. You drive and you think, oh, there must be gas stations and people. No, they're unmanned collection stations. They have periodic, people drive by and check on them, do maintenance, collect whatever, but they're basically empty. So what I was going to say is, when I came out here 2 years ago, almost now, a year and a half ago, this was a field that was clearly, running down. The production facility that they have up in Altamont is gigantic relative to the number of rigs they have. And just talking to people who've been here longer, including the people who are actually running the program, indeed, if you go back a couple years, there weren't 2 rigs, there were 3, and then 4, and then 6, and then you go back 10, 15 years, there were more than a dozen rigs out here. And that's just in the last decade. Like I said, this has been an area that's been under production since the 30s. And the consensus was that they were, quote-unquote, winding down. And that was very much the impression given, that these were mopping up, that they were just looking for the last little bits, the little patches of oil. And here, it's not like the Marcellus Shale where the entire formation is production. They're basically little pockets, they might even be football field-sized patches of porous rock that have hydrocarbons in them. And their impression was that they were just squeezing the last little bits out. And as they were getting to the last drop, they needed fewer and fewer rigs, and they slowly were reducing it. Now, they were still thinking that the 2 that they had would be busy. They told me that, they'd be busy for a year, and that was almost 2 years ago. But then last winter, 2 things happened. They developed a way to get the wells to cost considerably less. Just a little bit of technical knowledge, placing, I don't want to get too technical, but just a little bit of knowledge that actually I was able to provide, and my coworker, specified knowledge that that we possessed and that they possessed, with us, in conjunction with us. It's kind of a 2-piece of the puzzle thing. Allow them to reduce the costs of the drilling, I'd say by a decent fraction. I'm tempted to say as much as a third, but probably more like a tenth, something like that. But that's still a fairly decent decrease. But then they developed a new kind of method to look for oil, previous to the ones they've been using, some type of satellite imagery or some type of underground sonar that's able to detect it. I don't know the details. And when they did that, they realized that there is vastly more here than they had previously thought, which would explain the fact that every time we drill a well, we still find oil. I would be surprised, based on the number of wells that are here, you'd think that everything would be dry or pathetically small, and that wasn't the case. So even though this was a place that was winding down, that little bit of information, and this is an old field, this isn't like an unexplored area. This is probably one of the most well-documented geological areas in the world. North America generally is the most well-documented geologically of any continent, just because of all the oil production that's taken place. Oil companies don't care about science in the abstract, but they care about it in the sense that it can help them, that it can be profitable, and so they have the amount of data that they have aggregated over the years is, to say it's substantial would be an understatement. So this is not a new frontier, and yet new technology suddenly changed the entire horizon of how long this field is going to produce. And now they're talking about expanding, instead of just having 2 rigs, to maybe going to 5. It's one of those, I'll believe it when I see it, if I ever do. But this area, just that little bit of technical knowledge, it's classic Julian Simon insight, although I don't think he can take credit for entirely coming up with that idea, but he certainly popularized it. What was just basically a big desert, and it is. Look. This land's not arable. It's not even very good for grazing. There's actually very little in the way of even cattle. Actually, if you look farther north, you can actually see where the scrub starts to give way to cedar and stuff. We're right on the edge here. I believe the altitude here is 6,500 feet, give or take. The top of that ridge is about 7. Duchesne is about a little less than 6, and we're above Duchesne a couple hundred feet. Once you get over 7, at this latitude and whatever, this climate, you start to see a shift. Which, being from somebody who was far away from any major topographical alterations, I find really interesting. Oh, here's a convoy of supplies coming. I'm not going to say, but I know exactly what that stuff is and what it's doing. So this area, has new life. It's not to say it'd be easy to overstate and be like, oh, so there's enough oil here to, solve the energy crisis forever. Well, there's always going to be an energy crisis. As long as there's entropy, there's going to be a crisis. But when you hear estimates, when you hear that's based on yesterday's information, and it was only entrepreneurial interest that ever generated even the knowledge of what's here, not some academic going over the data in an objective way to quantify the world's reserves. So that's kind of overcast here. That's unusual. Look, it's pretty blue over there, but to the south it's fairly overcast. It's almost always sunny here. Something I started to take for granted pretty easily. So anyway, this is kind of for me as much as for anybody else. I'd kind of like to retain video of this area. I really want to go and explore those mountains more. I really can't when I'm at work. When I first came out here, I had about a week, and it took a little time. But that's something that you need a pack for, and I didn't have one. So, all right. Well, that's it, and I'll talk to y'all later.